I didn't say a word when the HOA president screamed about illegal modifications and unauthorized roadwork. I just pulled the 1952 county deed from my folder, set it on the conference table, and watched her face drain of color as she read. The part about sole ownership and perpetual access rights to Maple Creek Road, extending from Highway 47 to the northern property line, her lawyer went completely silent. The treasurer actually stood up and walked out, because what they were just realizing. What I'd figured out 3 months earlier while sitting in a military legal office in Germany was that the HOA had been charging fees, issuing permits, and collecting fines on a road that belonged entirely to me. A road that every single house in Creekside Estates depended on to get home. I wasn't trying to start anything when I moved back to my grandfather's place. After 8 years in the Army, including 2 deployments that left me with more metal in my leg than bone, I just wanted somewhere quiet to heal up and figure out what came next. The cabin had been sitting empty since Grandpa died in 2019. Just collecting dust and property taxes while I was overseas. It wasn't much to look at a 1960s ranch house with knotty pine walls and a stone fireplace, sitting on 47 acres of mixed woods and pasture at the end of what everyone called Maple Creek Road, but it was mine. Free and clear, and after years of sleeping in barracks and forward operating bases, the idea of waking up to nothing but birdsong and my own coffee schedule felt like the closest thing to paradise I could imagine. The road itself was just a 2-lane stretch of asphalt that wound through about 1.5 miles of woods before it reached my driveway. Nothing fancy, but well maintained, with good drainage and clear sight lines. I never thought much about who owned it or maintained it. It was just the way you got to Grandpa's house, the same way we'd driven it every summer when I was a kid. What I didn't know was that sometime in the early 2000s, a developer had built Creekside Estates, a collection of 36 McMansions, quarter-acre latsu along the first half of that road. Big houses with 3-car garages and HOA fees that could choke a horse, marketed to retirees and executives who wanted to feel like they lived in the country without actually dealing with septic systems or well-watered. The first sign of trouble came about 3 weeks after I'd gotten the utilities turned back on and started basic repairs. I was replacing some rotted deck boards when a woman in a white Lexus SUV pulled into my driveway. She was maybe 60, the kind of aggressive blonde highlights and perfectly pressed athleisure wear that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager," from 50 yards away. She introduced herself as Patricia Westman, president of the Creekside Estates Homeowners Association, and she was there to discuss some concerns about my property. The concerns, it turned out, were extensive. My truck was apparently too old and too rusty to be parked in common view areas. The lumber I'd stacked near my workshop was creating an unsightly storage situation. Most importantly, I needed to submit an application and pay a fee before doing any exterior modifications to my home, including the deck repairs I was literally in the middle of completing. When I pointed out that my property wasn't part of Creekside Estates and never had been, she smiled in that particular way that told me I was dealing with someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "The road you use to access your property runs directly through our community," she explained, like she was talking to a particularly slow child. "That makes you subject to our community standards and regulations. We've had several residents complain about the deteriorated condition of your property, and frankly, it's affecting property values for everyone." She handed me a packet of forms and a bill for $347 in road maintenance fees and administrative costs that were apparently 6 months overdue. I tried to be reasonable, explained that I'd just moved back from deployment, that I was working on fixing up the place, and that I'd never received any previous bills or notices. She listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a toddler, then informed me that the fees were non-negotiable and that any further modifications would require advance approval from the Architectural Review Committee. As she climbed back into her Lexus, she mentioned that the next HOA meeting was Thursday at 7, and that I was strongly encouraged to attend. I spent the rest of that week trying to make sense of the situation. I called the county assessor's office, checked my property tax records, and even drove down to City Hall to look at zoning maps. Everything confirmed what I already knew: my land wasn't part of any homeowners association. It was unincorporated county property that had been in my family since my great-grandfather bought it in 1952. But when I tried to research the road situation, things got complicated fast. The county showed Maple Creek Road as a private thoroughfare, which apparently meant it wasn't maintained by the state or county. The HOA's website claimed they were responsible for road maintenance and common area upkeep within their community boundaries. Thursday's HOA meeting was held in the community center they'd built near the entrance to Creekside Estates building. That looked like it belonged at a country club rather than in rural Pennsylvania. I showed up in jeans and a flannel shirt, which made me stand out among the polo shirts and pearl necklaces like a turd in a punch bowl. Patricia Westman ran the meeting with the efficiency of a drill sergeant and the warmth of a tax audit. There were reports on landscaping contracts, discussions about pool maintenance, and heated debate about whether the community Christmas decorations should be red and gold or red and silver this year. When they got to new business, Patricia announced that they'd be implementing enhanced enforcement of community standards, particularly regarding non-conforming properties that were negatively impacting the character of our neighborhood. She didn't mention me by name, but every head in the room turned to look at me when she started talking about deteriorated structures and inappropriate vehicle storage. When they opened the floor for questions, I stood up and politely asked for clarification about how their community standards could apply to property that wasn't part of their community. The room went dead quiet. Patricia's smile got tighter, and she explained in the tone you'd use with a difficult child that anyone who used community roads was subject to community standards. Period. When I pointed out that I'd never signed any HOA agreement and wasn't legally bound by their rules, the treasurer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like he did tax preparation for fun, cleared his throat and mentioned that there were legal remedies for dealing with non-compliant residents. The meeting moved on to discuss snow removal contracts, but the message was clear: fall in line or face consequences. I left that meeting knowing I was in for a fight, but I still tried to handle things diplomatically. I sent Patricia an email the next day outlining my legal position and offering to discuss any reasonable concerns about my property. Her response came back within an hour, a form letter informing me that my road usage fees were now 60 days overdue, and that continued. Non-payment would result in access restrictions and legal action. Attached was a new bill, this time for $547, with additional charges for violation processing and administrative overhead. That's when I stopped trying to be reasonable and started getting educated. I spent the next 2 weeks reading everything I could find about property law, easement rights, and HOA authority. I learned that homeowners associations, despite their grandiose names and official-sounding bylaws, are essentially private clubs with exactly as much legal authority as their members choose to give them. I also learned that in Pennsylvania, you can't just declare someone part of your HOA because it would be convenient for your budget projections, but the real education started when I found my grandfather's old filing cabinet in the basement, locked away behind his workshop. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: insurance papers, tax records, receipts for farm equipment that had been sold before I was born. But at the bottom of the second drawer, in a manila envelope marked road papers important, I found something that changed everything: the original deed for Maple Creek Road, dated June 15, 1952, transferring ownership from the county to my great-grandfather, Harold Morrison, for the sum of $1 and other valuable considerations. The document was only 2 pages long, but it was thorough. It granted perpetual ownership and maintenance responsibility for the thoroughfare known as Maple Creek Road, extending from State Highway 47 north to the Morrison property line.
Including all drainage,
Utility rights-of-way and access. Privileges. There was a survey map attached, showing the exact boundaries of the road right-of-way, and a note explaining that the county was transferring ownership because they couldn't afford to maintain rural roads that served fewer than 10 families. I sat in that basement for a long time, holding that deed and trying to process what it meant. The HOA hadn't just been collecting fees for maintaining a road they didn't own, they'd been doing it for nearly 20 years. The actual owner was overseas serving his country. Every road maintenance fee they'd collected, every permit they'd issued, every fine they'd threatened, had been based on authority they didn't have and never could have. The next morning, and paid $57 to have the deed authenticated and recorded in the current property records. The clerk, a woman who looked like she'd been working there since the Eisenhower administration, took one look at the 1952 document and shook her head. There's been an HOA collecting fees on this road for years, she said. They filed their annual reports right here in this office. I always wondered who actually owned it. She made copies of everything and handed me a receipt. You might want to talk to a lawyer, she suggested. This could get messy. It got messy faster than I expected. I found a bright orange chain stretched across Maple Creek Road, about 100 yards past the Creekside Estates entrance, with a sign that read "Private Road Nitrogen Monoxide. Unauthorized access violators will be towed." My own driveway was on the other side of that chain, along with 47 acres of land that I couldn't legally reach without crossing property that belonged to me. I called Patricia Westman's number and got voicemail. I left a polite message, explaining the situation and asking her to remove the chain. When she called back 3 hours later, her tone had shifted from condescending to openly hostile. "We've had multiple complaints about your vehicle traffic and inappropriate road usage," she informed me. "Until you bring your property into compliance with community standards and resolve your outstanding fee obligations, you'll need to find alternative access to your residence. Alternative access to land I owned, via a road I owned, blocked by people who had no legal right to block it. I explained about the deed, about the county records, about the fact that she was essentially holding my property hostage over fees I'd never owed in the first place. Her response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic arrogance. Our attorney has reviewed the situation. We're confident in our legal position. The road in question has been maintained by this association for over 20 years, which establishes adverse possession and maintenance responsibilities, regardless of any historical documents you may have discovered. Adverse possession. She was claiming that because they'd been maintaining my road without permission for 20 years, they now owned it. It was like someone mowing your lawn while you were at work, and claiming your house because they'd been taking care of the landscaping. But the legal principle was real. And if they could prove continuous maintenance and improvement, they might actually have a case. That night, I called my old platoon sergeant, Mike Kowalski, who'd gotten out 2 years before me and was working. As a paralegal in Philadelphia, Mike had always been the guy you went to when you needed to understand regulations or figure out how to navigate military bureaucracy. And he'd carried those skills into civilian life. And he listened without interrupting until I finished. "Here's the thing about adverse possession," he said, when I was done. "It only works if the true owner doesn't object. The moment you contest it, especially with a recorded deed, their clock stops. But more importantly, you said you've been deployed for most of the last 8 years, right? Pennsylvania law has specific protections for active duty military members. They can't claim adverse possession against someone who was physically unable to defend their property because they were serving their country." Mike put me in touch with a lawyer in Pittsburgh who specialized in property disputes and military legal issues. Janet Morrison, no relation. Despite the name, was a former Army JAG officer who'd been handling cases like mine since she got out in 2015. I drove down to meet with her the following Tuesday, bringing copies of the deed, the HOA's correspondence, and photos of the chain blocking my road. Janet reviewed everything with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years dealing with military legal issues. "This is actually pretty straightforward," she said after about an hour. "They have no legal basis for their claims, and blocking your access is illegal regardless of any fee disputes. The military deployment angle makes it even cleaner. There's no way they can claim adverse possession against someone who was serving overseas." She leaned back in her chair and smiled in a way that reminded me of Mike right before he'd find the regulation that proved some officer wrong. "But here's the interesting part. If they've been collecting fees for maintaining your road, they've been acting as your agents without authorization. That makes them liable for an accounting of every dollar they've collected and spent." We filed papers that afternoon, a petition to clear title, confirming my ownership of the road, an injunction to remove the chain and restore access, and a demand for full financial accounting of all fees collected for road maintenance since 2002. Janet also sent a formal letter to the HOA's attorney, explaining the legal situation and demanding immediate resolution. The letter was polite, but firm. It's a kind of professional communication that makes it clear you're not messing around anymore. The chain came down the next morning, but that was just the beginning. Over the following 3 weeks, I learned exactly how deep the HOA's financial incompetence ran. The road maintenance fees they'd been collecting hadn't been going into road maintenance, they'd been funding the community center mortgage, landscaping, contracts for the common areas, and administrative salaries that would make a Fortune 500 executive blush. In 20 years of collecting fees on my road, they'd spent less than $12,000 on actual maintenance, while collecting over $200,000 from residents. The best part came during the emergency HOA meeting they called. To address recent legal challenges, I wasn't invited, but I showed up anyway, walking into their community center like I owned the place, which technically I sort of did, since they'd built it with money collected for maintaining my property. Patricia Westman was in full damage control mode, explaining to increasingly angry residents that there had been some confusion about road ownership and that they were working with legal counsel to resolve the situation. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood up and introduced myself. "I'm the guy who actually owns the road," I said, holding up the certified deed. "And I've got some questions about where my money went." The room erupted. Residents who'd been paying road fees for years suddenly realized they'd been funding community amenities that had nothing to do with road maintenance. The treasurer tried to to explain about administrative overhead and integrated community planning, but you could see the math happening in people's heads. They'd been scammed by their own HOA board. 3 months later, Patricia Westman resigned, along with the treasurer and 2 other board members. The new board settled our lawsuit for $187,000, the full amount of road fees collected over 20 years, plus interest and legal costs. More importantly, they formally acknowledged my ownership of Maple Creek Road and agreed to a maintenance contract that actually made sense. They'd continue maintaining the portion of road that served their community. I'd maintain the portion that served only my property. Nobody would pretend to have authority they didn't actually possess. I also put up a sign at the property line that reads Morrison Road Private Property Authorized Vehicles Only. It's not meant to keep anyone out the new HOA board, and I actually get along fine. But it serves as a reminder of what happens when people assume they can take what doesn't belong to them just because the owner isn't around to object. The cabin renovation is coming along nicely. I've got the deck finished, the roof repaired, and I'm working on updating the kitchen and bathroom. My neighbors in Creekside Estates wave when they drive past now, and several of them have stopped by to introduce themselves properly and apologize for the previous board's behavior. Few have even asked for advice about dealing with HOA overreach in their previous communities. I still think about what Patricia Westman said that first day about my property affecting their property values. She was right, in a way, just not the way she thought. Having a neighbor who knows his rights and isn't afraid to defend them tends to keep everyone honest. It's amazing how much more reasonable people become when they realize you can't be bullied, manipulated, or intimidated into giving up what's rightfully yours. These days, when I sit on my deck in the evening with a beer and watch the sun set over land that's been in my family for 70 years, I think about my grandfather and great-grandfather and what they'd make of the whole situation. I think they'd be proud that I didn't back down, that I did the research, and that I handled it the right way through the law, not through anger or violence. Most of all, I think they'd be happy that the road they built, the road they paid for and maintained and passed down through 3 generations, is still in the family where it belongs. The quiet I was looking for when I came home from deployment, I found it. It just took a little longer and cost a little more than I expected.